Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel. Today we're diving into a topic that's been on everyone's minds: what happens when the war between Russia and Ukraine finally ends. For years, Ukraine has endured the hardships of conflict. Lives lost, families displaced, and communities shattered. But with the end of the war comes the promise of renewal. As the nation rebuilds, hope rises from the ashes. Before the outbreak of war, Ukraine was a country rich in history, culture, and natural beauty. It began with the Euromaidan protests in late 2013, sparked by then-President Viktor Yanukovych's decision to abandon plans for closer integration with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Russia. The protests quickly escalated into a full-blown revolution as Ukrainians demanded greater democracy, accountability, and an end to corruption. In the aftermath of Yanukovych's ousting, Russia seized the opportunity to annex Crimea, citing historical and strategic interests. This move was widely condemned by the international community and led to a significant escalation of tensions. Meanwhile, in eastern Ukraine, pro-Russian separatist movements emerged, fueled by ethnic and linguistic divisions, as well as grievances against the new pro-Western government in Kyiv. The conflict in eastern Ukraine quickly escalated into a full-scale war, marked by intense fighting, civilian casualties, and humanitarian crises. February 24, 2022, marked a critical turning point in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, igniting a new phase of the crisis. In a televised address, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation in eastern Ukraine, citing concerns over the security and rights of Russian-speaking populations. As Russian forces advanced towards the Ukrainian border, civilians in affected areas scrambled to evacuate, fearing the onset of war. The international community responded swiftly, condemning Russia's actions and calling for an immediate de-escalation of tensions. Emergency meetings were held at the United Nations and diplomatic efforts were intensified to find a peaceful resolution. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, the government mobilized its military and urged citizens to stand united in defense of their sovereignty and territorial integrity. Makeshift defenses were hastily erected, and communities braced themselves for the looming threat of conflict. But what if the war in Ukraine finally ends? Let's discuss. Frozen conflict, but no negotiated ceasefire. In this scenario, a frozen conflict comes about after Western arms shipments diminish, undermining Ukraine's offensive capabilities. Former President Donald Trump has encouraged congressional allies to vote against aid to Ukraine and has been critical of weapons transfers. A second Biden administration would continue to militarily support Ukraine, but might face more Republican opposition and be unable to pass needed legislation. Ukraine would most likely try to continue fighting with the Europeans, ramping up Kyiv's supplies of weapons. But unless Ukraine makes gains, European governments bereft of US backing will probably face pressures to negotiate with Moscow. Trump or other allied leaders might try to make a deal with Putin, but Moscow's conditions are likely to be too stringent. The Ukrainian government and people may also be opposed to settling the conflict and effectively ceding a fifth of their territory to Russia. With Moscow's war economy keeping his popularity high, Russian President Vladimir Putin may see some advantages with a frozen conflict so long as it keeps a rump and weakened Ukraine out of NATO. Probability. The election of Trump, along with cuts in US military support, increases the chances that Ukraine will not be able to make significant gains, but Kiev probably won't want to end the fighting and settle for a diminished homeland. The political costs of acceding to Putin's conditions are also likely to be too high for allied leaders. Ceasefire agreement. In this case, the drive to end hostilities would come from domestic fatigue in Ukraine and Russia, forcing, over time, a negotiated ceasefire. On the Ukrainian side, the growing scarcity of young recruits will also be a factor determining Kyiv's ability to continue fighting. Already, the average age of the latest recruits is in the 30-40 year range, rather than the usual 18 to 24 years. Kiev might also worry that the longer the war trails on, the less likely it is that a large number of Ukrainians will return to their homeland from EU countries. Refugee centers in Poland have closed because many Ukrainians have become independent and found their own lodgings either in Poland, other EU countries, or have gone back to Ukraine. Although still supportive of the war, those who have not returned to Ukraine may be less eager to leave the lives they have created for themselves elsewhere, making Ukraine's unfavorable demographic prospects even darker. Ukraine's birth rate is barely over 1 child per woman, and the likeliest outcome for Ukraine is that birth rates fall even further, as they did in Kuwait, Sri Lanka, and Armenia during wartime. In this scenario, the Russian public would also begin to grow tired of the mobilizations and duration of the conflict. Russians do not want the country to be seen losing, but already today, about half of those polled by the Russian non-governmental research organization Levada have consistently supported a ceasefire, including up to 1/3 of those who say they support the actions of Russian troops. If Russian forces can no longer appear to make large gains without additional call-ups, pressures could grow on the Kremlin to agree to a negotiated ceasefire. Probability. During the next several years, Russia and Ukraine could begin to explore a ceasefire with the help of a mediator like Turkey if the war continues to be one of attrition. This process might start with a series of temporary ceasefires over, for example, Orthodox Christmas, and grow into a more permanent ceasefire with support from backers on both sides for a stop in the fighting. A ceasefire would leave Kiev in a security limbo unless it was given security assurances from NATO countries about continued help in event of new fighting. There may be other questions that would need to be dealt with, such as prisoners, refugees, etc., that over time would lead both sides to start talks on an armistice should the peace hold. Peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia. If the armistice is over the horizon, a peace agreement is even more inconceivable and might not happen unless and until a new Russian leader wants to re-establish ties with the West and is willing to negotiate a deal. The Korean armistice is a testament to the difficulty of moving beyond an armistice to a peace treaty. There has been no peace treaty to end the Korean War. A peace treaty would be a bigger hurdle, particularly because Ukraine and likely most NATO members would insist that Putin or his successor admit Russia's wrongdoing and provide reparations. Signing a peace treaty that involves the US would require approval by 2/3 of the US Senate, which is difficult under any circumstances and unlikely if Putin is still in charge of Russia. Realistically, any peace treaty could only be made with a post-Putin government wanting to rebuild ties with the West, most likely for economic reasons. Probability. Close to nil in the foreseeable future. So, what do you think will happen when the war between Russia and Ukraine ends? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more updates. Until next time, stay curious.